Well, hey guys, in this video, we're going to be talking about things in your diet that may be causing your face to turn red. These are different categories of foods. We're going to cover 7 of them that could be leading to flushing, redness. If you are new here, welcome. My name is Andrea. I'm a board certified dermatologist. I upload skincare content here on YouTube pretty regularly. Definitely subscribe, hit the bell notification that tells you when my videos go live. Facial redness is something a lot of people cope with. It can be really embarrassing. And specifically, many people deal with a condition called rosacea. This is a chronic skin condition that is accompanied by sensitive skin and bouts of flushing, as well as sometimes little red bumps, even little pus bumps. Why people get rosacea is dictated by probably their genetics as well as a variety of environmental triggers, including diet. The role of diet as a potential trigger for facial redness is widely accepted. Many patients report that certain categories of foods trigger redness and that when they avoid those foods, the redness improves, especially those with rosacea who are typically encouraged to keep a diary of triggers for their symptoms. Now, I want to emphasize before getting into the categories of foods that what is a trigger for one person is not necessarily a trigger for another person. So this video is in no way, shape, or form telling you that you should cut out all of these foods. They're merely pointing out foods, categories of foods, and beverage, their potential mechanisms behind triggering facial redness. And if it sounds like it's something that is a trigger for you, then consider looking more into it. But don't just go eliminating stuff out of your diet. The number 1 dietary trigger for facial redness is alcohol. Alcoholic beverages, especially wine, red wine more so than white wine, as well as spirits. There's a large study that was conducted for over 14 years in patients with rosacea, and alcohol had a very strong link with rosacea severity. Why might alcohol trigger facial redness? Histamine gets released as a breakdown of different byproducts of alcohol metabolism like acetaldehyde and acetone. And histamine is a compound that leads to blood vessel dilation. It also leads to inflammation, and that can trigger facial redness. Alcohol is not only a trigger for rosacea, but other issues related to facial redness like urticaria, otherwise known as hives. Alcohol frequently triggers and worsens different types of chronic itch as well. Aside from histamine, another possible mechanism by which alcohol leads to facial redness is actually through opioid-like effects in the skin. This was demonstrated in a study where people who were flushed with alcohol consumption were given a compound called naltrexone, which blocks the opioid receptors. And you have opioid receptors in your skin. When they then consumed alcohol after taking this opioid blocker, they didn't have any flushing. There are these little proteins throughout your skin that you've got to know about if you care at all about skin. And those are called transient receptor potential ion channels, or TRP channels. These channels regulate the skin barrier, they dictate cell proliferation and differentiation, and they also play a key role in how the immune system goes about doing its thing in the skin. Certain compounds bind to these transient receptor potential, or TRP channels, and lead to blood vessel dilation. The TRP channel TRPV1, it sits on the little nerves that course through our skin, as well as on the skin cells called keratinocytes. And this ion channel is activated by alcohol. The downstream effect of that is inflammation coming to the skin, vasodilation, and sensory symptoms of burning, stinging, and discomfort. This inflammatory cascade also leads to increases in transepidermal water loss. That's why a lot of people who deal with facial redness also have associated dryness of the skin, likely mediated by activation of these TRPV1 channels, and alcohol is a known activator, as are a variety of other dietary triggers that we're going to get into in a moment. So alcohol is a big one, and you can see there are a variety of mechanisms. Whether you have rosacea or not, it certainly can trigger facial redness. Many people of Asian descent are slow metabolizers of alcohol. They have buildup of that acetaldehyde metabolite, and they develop flushing that is quite intense with very limited alcohol consumption. They metabolize it less well, and it can definitely lead to facial redness. Dietary factor number 2 that can trigger facial redness is capsaicin. What the heck is that? Capsaicin is something in spicy food like peppers that binds to these TRP channels and leads to symptoms of burning and pain. If you've ever eaten a spicy pepper and you have a burning mouth, it is because of the trip channels. When I say spicy, I'm talking about like chili peppers, hot sauce, cayenne, jalapeno. Capsaicin is a colorless oil and it binds to these TRP channels, but it's got this unique long hydrocarbon tail that allows it to really bind quite tenaciously to these channels and kind of glom on there and really activate them. That is why you get burning mouth with like certain chili peppers. And it's related to the relative amount of capsaicin in the pepper. It's most abundant actually in the membranes around the seeds in chili peppers. So if you ever chop up chili peppers and you don't want the dish to be as spicy, you've probably been told to remove the seeds. That's why the capsaicin is most abundant in that outer membranous part of the seed. While capsaicin is most abundant in your chili peppers, it can also be found in low amounts in certain spices like oregano, cilantro, and cinnamon. If you're into spicy food, perhaps you have heard of something called the Scoville Heat Scale. A pharmacist by the name of Wilbur Scoville came up with this, ranks different chili peppers based on their capsaicin content, kind of as a guide to how spicy it's going to be. Capsaicin binds very tenaciously to those trip channels. You get that burning sensation, and you also get vasodilation of the blood vessels in the skin, leading to facial redness. Most people don't just go around snacking on chili peppers. Maybe you do, I don't. But some cuisines actually end up layering a few different ingredients, each with quite a bit of capsaicin. So for example, you can imagine that if you have a chili or curry that's made with chili peppers, and then you go adding in certain spices that have a moderate amount of capsaicin, you end up getting quite a mega dose of capsaicin. And this is reflected in how avoidant many people with rosacea are of certain types of cuisine. In a survey of patients with rosacea, 49% of them avoided Mexican food. They can't tolerate it because it just exacerbates their facial redness. 33% avoided Indian food. That sounds miserable. Indian food is one of my favorites. And 27% had to avoid Thai food, another one of my favorites. These types of cuisine frequently incorporate high capsaicin foods, like many chili peppers. And so I guess that makes sense, but yeah, doesn't sound like much fun to me. Dietary factor number 3 is cinnamaldehyde. This is a compound that is most abundant in like cinnamon, as the name would imply, but it's also in a variety of other foods: tomatoes, citrus fruits, and chocolate. Cinnamaldehyde binds to those trip channels, leading to dilation of the blood vessels and facial redness. For people with rosacea, this also can elicit their symptoms of burning and stinging, and it can aggravate the appearance of something called telangiectasias, persistently little dilated blood vessels, like most obvious on the nose and the cheeks. So people who are sensitive to cinnamaldehyde, they have to avoid like chocolate, citrus fruits, tomato-based dishes, and cooking the tomato doesn't get rid of the cinnamaldehyde. In that study that surveyed people with rosacea about their dietary patterns and triggers, 25% of them actually had to avoid Italian food. And the other thing, you know, I mentioned cinnamon, but cinnamon also has a moderate amount of capsaicin. So you have those little trip channels to blame, and you can imagine how different dishes that combine a few of these ingredients, like maybe a chocolate covered orange, would be even more problematic or a more likely trigger for somebody who is sensitive to these compounds in foods. Dietary factor number 4 is going to be hot liquids. 33% of people with rosacea find that they have to avoid hot coffee, and 30% find they have to avoid tea. It's probably related to the temperature. When you have heat from hot liquids, that's going to cause the blood vessels in the skin to dilate. That can lead to flushing and redness. Heat also triggers the sympathetic nervous system. One thing that's been investigated with regards to the coffee association is there's been this question, is it related to caffeine? Interestingly enough, one study showed that caffeinated coffee had an inverse relationship with rosacea, meaning the more caffeinated coffee you consumed, the less likely you were to have rosacea. And this wasn't true for other caffeinated foods or beverages like caffeinated soda, caffeinated tea, or chocolate. chocolate. And that, again, may be related to other compounds in those foods, but it's interesting, and it's thought maybe it has to do with the fact that caffeine has a vasoconstrictive effect, helping to reduce redness. I really think a big driving force when it comes to these beverages, though, is drinking them hot for people with redness as a major trigger, because there was a study that showed that if you gave people coffee or you gave them water at 22 degrees Celsius, neither the coffee nor the water at 22 degrees Celsius triggered redness in the face. However, when you heated that liquid up to 60 degrees Celsius, both the coffee as well as the water triggered facial redness. So a lot of it likely has to do with the temperature, but some of these other liquids, they do have other compounds in them that could in fact trigger rosacea or redness. Things like cinnamaldehyde. If you're having, say, a latte with cinnamon on top, now you've got the heat and you've got the cinnamon. If you're having hot chocolate with cinnamon on it, you can see how the heat plus the cinnamon plus the chocolate may be an aggravating factor for you. So for some people, maybe they tolerate iced coffee just fine. They don't have that temperature effect. You know, maybe the caffeine ends up helping them out and they have no issue with it. Dietary factor number 5 are foods that release histamine. I mentioned this in the beginning when I was explaining how alcohol triggers redness, but histamine is a compound that gets released by cells in the immune system called mast cells, kind of to orchestrate inflammation and lead to blood vessel dilation. And that is what precipitates not only redness, but symptoms of itch and discomfort. If you have hives, histamine release is a major factor in the formation of hives. You also have an increase in blood flow, leading to more redness. Certain foods contain histamine, and some people are actually intolerant to histamine. There's an enzyme that breaks down histamine called diamine oxidase. Some people may have insufficient levels of that or insufficient activity of that enzyme. So when this enzyme activity is impaired, histamine accumulates, can lead to symptoms of redness, hives, flushing, rosacea symptoms. It's estimated that up to 1% of the US actually has a histamine intolerance. Foods that are rich in histamine include aged cheeses, smoked meats, processed meats, sauerkraut, shellfish, wine. And to remind you, not only here does wine have a good amount of histamine in it, but its metabolites, the breakdown of the alcohol, can trigger histamine release as well. Eggplant, avocado, tomato, and spinach. So here we have tomato again. Tomato, as a reminder, is high in cinnamaldehyde, and it's also rich in histamine. So those two things together make it a food that a lot of people end up not tolerating, especially those prone to rosacea. But again, to reiterate, it's a trigger for some people, but not for everyone. If you've never had any issue with tomato-based foods, don't just go cutting them out randomly to see if it helps. Dietary factor number 6 that could be making your face red. Not as robust in terms of the research to support it, but definitely worth mentioning, and that is diets rich in fatty foods. Fatty cuts of meat, lard, and fried foods have been associated with worse rosacea. And this may be due to the inflammatory effects of these foods on the body as a whole, or it may be related to an imbalance in like the skin lipids, leading to more water loss out of the skin. Those are merely speculative. I would say more research really needs to be done to kind of nail this down, but it makes sense to consider fatty foods as a potential trigger, given that they can be quite inflammatory. When I say fatty foods, I'm specifically talking about fatty cuts of meat, lard, and fried foods. I'm not talking about fat as a general macronutrient. And last but not least is foods high in niacin. Niacin can definitely precipitate a flush. Niacin actually binds to receptors on the surface of a skin cell called the Langerhans cell, and the downstream effect of that is release of inflammatory mediators, namely prostaglandins, that lead to blood vessel dilation. Niacin-rich foods include poultry like chicken breast, tuna, salmon, peanuts, crustaceans, and liver. All right, you guys, so those are 7 things that can be found in the diet and different types of foods that can trigger redness for some people. But I want to make it clear, what triggers redness for one person is not necessarily a trigger for everyone. Again, don't just go cutting out stuff out of your diet. My goal in making this video is merely to educate you as to the mechanisms in which certain compounds in different types of foods can lead to flushing and redness in people who are sensitive to those, but it is by no means telling you cut these foods out. So let me know, those of you out there, I know a lot of you deal with rosacea, are any of these food categories problematic with you? I know some of you are dealing with hives, definitely alcohol. I guess I would say, well, I told you not to cut anything out. Cutting alcohol out of your diet, I see no harm in doing that. But yeah, let me know in the comments, are any of these foods problematic for you? Alcohol, again, is a common trigger for itch, redness, hives, and definitely a rosacea trigger for a lot of people. I hope this was informative. On the end slate, I'm going to put my recent video where I talk about causes of facial redness, so definitely check that out if that's something that you're coping with. I go over a lot of reasons why your face may be red. But if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and as always, don't forget, sunscreen and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Bye.